Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream Vision Value podcast. Today, I'm joined by Ted Pilcher. He's a fan of the channel. But Ted's here today, and he wants to present his theory on how to solve the synoptic problem. So, welcome to the show, Ted.
Oh, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So, tell us, how do you view the synoptic problem, and how do you think it should be solved?
Okay, I've watched a lot on this, and so I'll just start with I have sources in my paper, but I think I won't interrupt the flow as I go along. I'll name a few that really influenced me on this. Alan Garrow, which is where I started, Bart Ehrman in the Schaefer lectures, Mark Goodacre and his explanation, really good explanation of the problem without giving you the solution. And last, Marcus Vincent, who gave me the final piece, someone featured on your channel, I think, several times. However, I do have to remember the words of James White, who said that in this field, whatever viewpoint that you want to hold, just look and you'll find a scholar that agrees with you. So, into the synoptic problem, which people are probably aware of. The dominant theory, Matthew and Luke independently use Mark and a lost document they call Q. There must also be a brick wall between Matthew and Luke, because as soon as one knows the other, direct reliance of one on the other becomes the reason for the shared material not found in Mark. My proposed solution to the synoptic problem is simply stated. Mark was written first. Luke version 1 was written second using Mark and the Didache as sources. This is the version of Mark that Marcion, approximately dated 85 to 160 when he lived, it's the version he possessed. Matthew wrote third using these three sources. Unaware of Matthew, Luke greatly expanded the original and created version 2, which is the canonical edition. Now, the Didache is considered a composite document that has been dated as late as 150 and as early, at least in part, prior to the year 70 before the Gospels were written. If it's this early, it may have been a source for both Luke and Matthew. We know that Marcion had a shorter version of canonical Luke. He was accused of expunging huge chunks of Luke to suit his own purpose by early church fathers such as Tertullian, Epiphanius, and Irenaeus. These church fathers certainly were able to recognize this gospel as a version of Luke. However, likewise, Marcion accused them of adding these same chunks to their version to prop up their theology versus his. But against this is what Tertullian asserts, is he is basically not removed enough to prove his theology. To quote him, your labor has been in vain, even in your gospel, Christ Jesus is mine. You simply should not ascribe to malevolence what can just as easily be attributed to ignorance. Marcion just had an early version of Luke, version 1, so to speak, in my opinion. The proposed original version of Luke could also be used to support a docetic view of Jesus, which was popular in early Christianity. This gospel that Marcion possessed lacked any infancy narrative, as does Mark and John. These two chapters having been added in a possibly late and final redaction, maybe even after the composition of Acts. Beyond missing the first two chapters, any reconstruction of what Marcion's gospel may have actually contained is not certain. Possibly also missing was the baptism of Jesus and the genealogy. The teaching of John the Baptist, however, could very well be there. It has been asserted that John is present in Marcion's gospel, and Luke 6:16 shows a border sign between the old Jewish tradition and the kingdom of heaven. It also may not contain two of the most popular parables, the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, which are only in Luke. And it began like this. In the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Jesus descended into Capernaum, a city in Galilee, and was teaching on the Sabbath days, which explains the oddity of Luke 4:23. Whatsoever we have heard done in Capernaum, do also here in thy country. Yet it is not until verse 31 that Jesus went to Capernaum. These reconstructions rely in entirety on quotes from early church fathers who have made mistakes from time to time and were completely in opposition to Marcion, as no actual copy of Marcion's gospel survives. I propose this early version of Luke is what Matthew had to work with in addition to Mark and possibly the Didache. Luke version 1 had only Mark and the Didache as sources. Now you can build the brick wall between Matthew and Luke version 2. Luke greatly expanded the original with the addition of new material while retaining the original order, completely ignorant of Matthew's project. Matthew was equally unaware of Luke's redaction of his own original, if in fact version 1 was written by the same author, which is by no means certain. This thesis may necessitate pulling the dating of Matthew forward to canonical Luke. The more time being elapsed between the two decreases the likelihood of them being independent of each other, similar to the Q theory that Matthew and Luke were unaware of each other. Now, the idea of a lost source, Q, used by both Matthew and Luke is a potential solution and very popular theory among scholars. The Farrer hypothesis is less popular but gaining adherents. To simply say that we do not have an extant copy of Q may be a weak argument against it, but it is still another brick in the wall. Likewise, the complete silence of any reference to this lost document, save one oblique comment in the writings of Papias to what only may have been this document. We have it only in a quote preserved by church fathers from his lost writings. As for other documents, for instance, even though we do not have an extant copy of something like the Diatessaron, we certainly have numerous references to its existence, even the author's name, and this is one more brick. It must be said that the Q idea has strong support against Farrer in at least three arguments. The weakest, in my opinion, is alternating primitivity in sayings between Matthew and Luke. How is it possible? How is that possible if one copies from the other? The primitivity of a saying is, however, many times in the eye of the beholder. Do sayings get longer and more developed over time, or do they get shorter? It seems both may happen. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Somehow gets, and at the worst possible moment, added to it, while Occam's razor gets shortened until almost unrecognizable to the original. This being said, it's difficult to see how Luke could revise the Lord's Prayer if he copies from Matthew. It's equally difficult to see how Luke's parable of the 10 servants and coins could be adapted from Matthew's 3 talents. The other way around makes more sense. Matthew using Luke and improving it against the Farrer theory. Alternately, we could have both using Q independently. Luke, as is, more original, and Matthew improving it for his gospel. The infancy narratives present another problem for Farrer and a much more difficult one to fathom. Q, supposedly, has no birth narrative as reconstructed. So each author goes his own way separately. Under the Farrer theory, Luke would have to completely reject Matthew's entire account and substitute an entirely new narrative. Likewise, the genealogies present the same difficulty. Finally, I bring out Matthew's perfect order, so to speak, or at least better order than Luke, which seems evident from even a casual reading of both. In this instance, it would appear that Matthew is improving Luke and not the other way around. If the two are writing independently, this presents no problem at all. As a note, most proposed reconstructions of the Q document will follow Luke's order, strangely enough. As a factor against Matthew using Luke is why would Matthew omit so many of the impressive parables in Luke? This seems strange, but if they were not in Q and Matthew and Luke wrote independently, this difficulty disappears. The Q theory also assumes a brick wall between Matthew and Luke. Therefore, likely they were written close together chronologically. Now, how far will they go to be fairer? One advocate of this thesis surveyed Jesus movies to see what various directors did with the Sermon on the Mount, and he found that, like Luke, the sayings were scattered instead of being grouped together, as in Matthew. He found, strangely enough, one movie even entitled The Gospel According to Matthew from 1964 by an acclaimed director, which I can't pronounce outside of maybe the last name, Pasolini, and he did similar scatterings. I watched the movie. It seems a little dreary to me. One final note, another scholar deduced, how I do not know, that Luke worked with scrolls and Matthew used codices. In my uninformed opinion, for all we know, either of them could have written or drafted on a wall to organize the material. After all, you can't very well lose a wall, can you? And I attribute that quote to Patrick Troughton. And hopefully, I don't know what the time is, but hopefully I've done a good job in being brief.
Yeah, I think you were pretty brief, but yeah, you were the way you talk about blocks is kind of like not blocks, the brick wall between Luke and Matthew, as you say. Kind of reminds me of the videos that Alan Gara, who was on the channel twice, that's the way he goes about it. He talked about it on, I think, both interviews, definitely the second interview I did with him, and he also talked about it on his blog. He did a series of videos in which he's backing the Matthean posteriority hypothesis. You know, it is true. There are some scholars that will say that, yeah, you can pretty much find a scholar for pretty much any position, supporting any position on how to solve the synoptic problem. But then there are also scholars like Delbert Burkett, and in a sense, he presents a different solution to the synoptic problem, but in a way he gives up on it, because what he does is he says, instead of just trying to say Matthew used Mark and Luke used Mark and I don't know, Luke used Matthew or Matthew used Luke or neither, he just decides to say they're all independent. He thinks all three of them are independent. They didn't use each other. And he says that Luke used proto-Mark B. He also thinks that Mark uses proto-Mark B. He has a bunch of proto-Marks in his diagram. And he has Mark and Matthew using proto-Mark A. And then he has this thing in which about 1% of Mark is unique Mark material. He calls it K. And so he says, okay, the K material and Mark is material that Matthew and Luke don't borrow from Mark. Okay. So he calls that the K document. And so what happens is Mark borrows from proto-Mark A and B and combines it together. And Mark is basically coalescing those two texts. And to him, this explains why Matthew and Luke differ often on their Mark and wording. You don't have to try to make that work by having both of them copy Mark differently. You just have them copying two different redactions of proto-Mark, A and B. That's how he looks at it. And he says canonical Mark is just the synergy of a combination of community A and community B. And there are other scholars that also think similarly to him, that all three gospels are independently copying sources. Because in their view, it's pretty much practically impossible to show which synoptic gospel used what. I myself don't even agree with this. I find Delbert's work fascinating, but I think the majority of scholars have done a fair job in showing that Matthew and Luke knew Mark. And I don't think we need to say they copied proto-Marks, a bunch of proto-Marks, because, well, you got like I think the idea, one of the reasons he goes with this is because K, the K material in Mark is material in Mark that's not in Matthew and Luke. So he says that's it. That means that Matthew and Luke didn't use that version of Mark. But there's unique material in Matthew and Luke as well. So does it mean every single time that somebody copies another text and doesn't copy parts of it, leaves parts of it out, does that mean he didn't copy it at all? You have to invent a hypothetical document. I think that's problematic. So I just wanted to put that out there because that is in the review you may not have been aware of. The idea they're just all independent.
I have heard people say more than one that they are all independent of each other.
Yeah.
That seems to be against the majority of scholarship, though. And I am actually not familiar with his work.
Yeah.
So that's something I need to look at. And my mentioning of, I have to say this because I don't want to claim responsibility for this because it's not original of me. The wall between the two, that is Alan Garrow, whom I cited. That is his idea. I think he calls it the Berlin Wall between the two.
That's exactly what he says. But yeah, your position does remind me of his. So you think that Matthew used an earlier version of Luke, but he didn't use canonical Luke. Is that correct?
That is where that we differ. Without Alan Garrow, I wouldn't even I wouldn't even have gone this direction. It would not have ever occurred to me. But his work started me, and it seemed to make more sense if there was an early version of Luke that he copied, that he got the information. It seems to make everything fit better. Then you don't have to look at the individual. You're looking at individual units of text and see which direction they point. And I wouldn't, making up stuff. I really don't care for wild conjectures, and I try to avoid it. But the fact that Marcion had this shorter version of Luke, where did he get it? I mean, did he do what the traditional view is? Did he take and wipe out huge chunks of it, change it, wipe out bits and pieces, almost half it or something? Did he do that? I mean, certainly it's possible. Or did he use just what he found, what he had? Did he only use that? But it's pretty much fact that he had an early gospel that could have been used. And I think, well, I'm sure Bart Ehrman talks about this in his Schaeffer lectures.
Yeah, I've had Bart Ehrman on a few times, and as I'm sure most of his readers remember, his position is that Matthew Luke borrowed from Mark, as you know, and Matthew Luke borrowed from Q. He also goes with M and L. Matthew borrowed from M, Luke borrowed from L. I don't currently remember what Bart thinks about John. If I remember correctly, though, I think he thinks John is independent of the Synoptics. But Dale Martin, and he's been on my channel too, Dale Martin, he thinks that John probably knew Mark. He's not sure about Matthew and Luke, but there are scholars out there like Mark Goodacre that suggest that John is familiar with the Synoptics. I think I agree with Goodacre that John's familiar with the Synoptics, and there are other scholars out there like James Barker. He wrote a book called I think it's called John's Use of Matthew, something like that, and he makes an argument that John copies from Matthew, and I think his argument's pretty solid. Because John is the fourth gospel, which pretty much every scholar says that, as far as I know. There was somebody that believed that John was the first gospel a while back, and there's a couple other scholars I think that held that position too, but it's an extremely minority of scholars that believe that. But since John is so far out after the Synoptics. It's the fourth gospel. It's supposed to be extremely late. I found it hard to believe that that the author of John never read the Synoptics personally.
I don't. I don't know. I have
Yeah.
heard that John is a composite, and it was something which they call the Signs Gospel that was incorporated into John, and that this could be earlier than some of the Synoptics. And I know that Bart Ehrman holds 2Q, or at least last I've heard. But he gave a presentation talking about the possibility, a very good possibility, of Marcion having an early version of Luke.
So in your opinion, when do you date these gospels? Do you put them all in the first century, some of them in the first, some of them in the second century CE, or do you put them all in the second century CE?
I'm not really sure on the dating of these things. Difficult to date. The date ranges seem all over the place. So I'm not very firm on any of these dates. I mean, there are some that will actually date at least part of the Didache prior to the Gospels. And as far as attaching a date to it, I just don't know. Although they say have to be after 70, though the majority of the scholars have to be after 70 because of the destruction of Jerusalem. It seems to be a prediction. Therefore, you have to put that in there as it couldn't be before that war got underway. However, what is the abomination of desolation sitting where it shouldn't, standing where it shouldn't? I don't think that happened until after Bar Kokhba.
Yes, Bartos indicated that. I think this abomination of desolation thing is only in Matthew. The other gospels do mention it, the abomination or a desolation. Luke has a vague version of it that's a bit different from Mark and Matthew. Matthew specifically states something different, though, as Bartosz Adamczewski, I think, makes a persuasive argument on this, because he said this one of the interviews I did with him. I think he covered this in the first interview I did with him on Matthew's use of Luke. Bartos says that Matthew states that the abomination of desolation stands in the way of the holy place. Now, the way that Matthew expresses it is different, because the other gospels don't say it. They don't put it that way. The holy place is not mentioned when the abomination of desolation is mentioned. So, in Bartos' view, and I think he's right, this suggests that it's a reference to the Aelia Capitolina being, and I would say being finished by 132 CE, which is pretty much what he says too, and that means Matthew is familiar with at least the beginning of Bar Kokhba. That because the Aelia Capitolina took a long time to build. It started construction in 117 CE and it finished in 132, if I remember correctly. And by 132 CE, the final structure covered the holy place, and that I think was either one of the main causes, if not the cause of the war, because that the Assignment Bar Kokhba, of course, wanted to rebel and free Israel from Roman occupation, but covering over the holy place, yeah, that would have set them off for sure.
Or did they do it, or was it this afterwards, after he was finished? I mean, I think as far as reasons for a war, lots of times for a rebellion and stuff, why do people start something like this? Well, they think they can get away with it.
Yeah.
I just think it's that simple.
So do you think that Q was written in stages, or do you think Q might be unnecessary. What is your view on Q?
Q has, and I pointed out some of these, it has strong points going in its favor. Certainly, it wouldn't have survived this long and still be the dominant theory,
Right.
if it didn't have strong points. But if you go to that, if you go to Q and say there is a Q, why can't you then just go and say, why does Q have to be a single document? It could be multiple documents. There could be more than one. I mean, there could be two, which would explain some of the differences. There could be three. There could be half a dozen. When you're making up a document, when it's a pure hypothetical, you have no assurance of what's in there and what's not. I heard somebody, and he had some credentials, make a point that he thought that the adulteress, the pericope of the woman that had committed adultery in John was part of the Q document. I've heard somebody say that. Somebody with some credentials. But as far as I really don't think that there really was a single Q document. I don't think that at all.
The late Burton Mack would agree with that, and John Kloppenborg believes that Q was written in stages himself. I think Bartos and other Q critics like him, like Mark Goodacre and others, will point out that the problem with not having a document, well, we just hypothesize what's in it. Anybody could put anything in there. And the majority of scholars say there's no passion narrative in Q, but there are several scholars out there that I know about that think that Q had a passion narrative, and that's exactly what the Q critics will say. Is right there. Like they keep having different opinions about what's in there. Without, as Bartos says, without a manuscript, there's no control. You can put anything in there. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he said in one of my interviews I did with him. I think Marcus Vincent and other Marcionite scholars, such as himself, I think he makes a strong case that the gospel of Marcion, but I agree with Matthias Klinghardt. I don't think Marcion wrote the gospel of the Lord due to theological differences that doesn't, like, there's some things in the gospel of the Lord that I don't think Marcion would have been comfortable writing. Like, for example, Jesus came to fulfill the law, the Torah. So he's under the law. That's not something Marcion would have wanted to say because he was anti-Torah, very, very anti-Torah. But I don't want to take too much. I don't want to speak too much longer here. I just want to finish this thought and say, I think there's a good chance that the gospel of the Lord could explain the double tradition without the hypothetical Q document.
Exactly. That was one of the things that I was trying to get at.
If you lean towards any direction when it comes to the dating, I know you're saying that you don't know, but where would you be most comfortable putting these documents if you had to give an answer?
I would actually go with approximately late 60s, early 70s for Mark, and then maybe 5-10 years later or something for the first version of Luke. Then you maybe add another 15 years, 10, 15, maybe 20 to get canonical Matthew, canonical Luke. And, I'm sort of just thinking as fast as I can on this without really trying to work on the dating, because that was something I really didn't spend a lot of time on, sort of saying primarily what others have said.
Is there anything else that you feel that you should mention here to about the synoptic problem, or do you think you've pretty much covered it?
Well, I think I pretty much put that out there, what I wanted to cover.
Okay.
Maybe I'll get some interesting feedback on this. Certainly got somebody to check out that you have mentioned. I will fit with the finishing, because I do hate it when well, not really hate it, but it just seems, difficult to see where somebody's coming from. And I want to put out there that I am a Christian.
Okay.
I'm looking at this stuff, looking at it critically, and I consider myself to be a defender of the faith, maybe a very bad one, but well, I do consider myself to be that. I mean, I think as far as trying to be a Christian, if I don't fail at it every day, I fail every other day. And I claim to be a disciple, which I've never met him, a disciple of William Lane Craig and Grady Nutt. Reverend Grady Nutt, he died in 82, and I met him as a child that I don't even really remember.
Oh, wow.
But he was known as the Prime Minister of Comedy, and he was a big name at the time, back in the days when there were 3 channels. He was on TV quite a few times, and a regular on Hee Haw of all things. So that is where I'm coming from. I mean, I don't want this. I don't like to. Once I get revved up, I can start talking. But I just have like this. I believe that this stuff that there is a solution to this, and it doesn't involve Q. And you've added something to it. You've added K as a source. So now I can say KLMNOPUQ. There was no Q.
There's also a C that Delbert believes in too. C. I admit I have a hard time understanding this particular hypothetical document, because C is supposed to be material somewhat in common between all the sources, including hypothetical sources, but Mark, Matthew, and Luke somehow all know C, so I'm including, I think, even proto-Marks A and B, if I remember correctly. That one confounds me. I don't know how that works.
Well, the C doesn't fit in the alphabet, but the Q comes right. I mean, the K comes right. Okay, I don't know the alphabet now. The K comes right before L.
There you go.
So I can start with KLMNO, to just try to be funny, but I have to remember I'm a humorless person and not very funny at all.
Yeah.
So there's all, you can have typical anomalies and all this stuff.
Well, this is great talking to you, Ted.
And it was really great. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. It was really great to talk to you, really great to interact with you. Your channel is it's really great. It has a lot of people on it that are Jack Bull. Gosh, he is really good.
Yeah, he is.
Really enjoyed a lot of his work, and I hope he can continue it.
Oh, he is. Him and I are writing something together too, as a matter of fact. Now I look forward to showing it once it's finished. Because what's interesting is him and I actually think a lot alike when it comes to Paul, but we also have a lot of differences. Yeah, him and I also agree on so much, including when we date the epistles, pretty much. So it's very interesting how him and I came to similar conclusions before I even met him, and because he's the PhD student of Marcus Vincent.
Correct.
And yeah, it was really nice to get him on. He wanted to come on. He's like, he told me that he was the student of Vincent. I'm like, oh, let's bring this guy on. Fascinating stuff about Paul and Ignatius. Especially his work on Ignatius. I love his work on Ignatius. I find it very convincing too.
He's going to end up whittling them way down.
Yeah. But by the way, just to I just want to state real quick, Ted, you didn't interrupt me, by the way. I was finished with that thought at the moment when you decided to speak. So don't feel like you interrupted. You didn't. But yeah, I'll repeat one more time. Thank you for coming on, and also thank you for your support. And if anyone else wants to become a fan guest of the channel, check out the Patreon page and check out Tier 7. Or you can read what Tier 7 states, and if you want to do it one time instead of monthly, you can send it to me through PayPal. And you can also email me. The email's in the description below, so you can jump on here just like Ted did and just like Matt did. Anyway, thanks again, Ted.
Well, thank you very much, and I feel honored to make an appearance on your channel, History Valley. Thumbs up.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.